Welcome to EdTech Speaks, a podcast bringing guests together to share their expertise and advice on navigating business and education in a technology-driven world. From entrepreneurs to vendors, higher education to corporate leaders, we'll uncover their perspective regarding the latest trends and technologies impacting your career or business. Our podcast is made possible by Downing EdTech Consulting, where people and technology connect. Hosted by Cher Downing, an experienced executive spanning a higher education and corporate career with specific focus on the EdTech industry. Dr. Downing is also an international and national presenter, author, and regular media contributor. Now here is your host, EdTech strategist, Dr. Cher Downing.
Hi, everyone. Welcome to EdTech Speaks, a podcast where we bring guests to share their expertise and advice on navigating business and education in a technology-driven world. Our goal is to provide you with options for products, services, and knowledge that can help you benefit yourself or your business. I'm Cher Downing, your host, and today I want to introduce an exciting guest, Matt Abrams, who's the author of Think Faster, Talk Smarter, and is also the host of the Think Fast, Talk Smart podcast. Welcome, Matt.
Sure. I'm so excited to be here with you. Thank you for having me on.
Well, I am thrilled because you have a new book coming out and we're going to be talking about that. But I really want to kind of start at the roots of how you came into this and your focus, but also because I know for our audience out there, communication and public speaking and doing all of these things are really difficult for a lot of people. And it's what holds them back oftentimes from really great opportunities, particularly in the ed tech field. But let's hear about how you got started in all of this.
Well, I can take you way back to my interest in communication, but it's all. Let me share two stories that sort of give insight into how I came to be interested in communication. Both of them happened when I was quite young. So when I was 7 or 8, my mother got very upset at my brother and me for all the stuff we had lying around the house. And I grew up in a community where people would do garage sales, yard sales all the time. And my mother said, "We are having a garage sale. We need to get rid of all of this." And as she was instructing us to make the signs, she said, "Misspell the word garage because our signs will stand out." And if you insert the letter B in the word garage, you get garbage. So we had garbage sales while everybody in the neighborhood was having a garage sale. And it turns out we sold more stuff than anybody else that weekend. And to this day, my mother thinks it's because we drew attention to us from the sign. I think people just thought we were stupid and they'd get better deals. But the point was, at that very early age, I learned how important communication can be into influencing other people and communicating your idea in a way that makes it stand out. So that's how I became really interested in communication. This notion of spontaneous speaking, which is what the book is about, on how to respond in the moment, that came about through my childhood as well. My last name is Abrahams. I always went first in school. Teachers, and I was one of them. And I know you were a teacher as well.
Yeah.
You get lazy and we just seat students alphabetically. Well, I was always left-hand side of the room, first seat. So my whole high school, elementary, undergrad, I was always first. So I've always been spontaneous speaking. And so I got used to it and comfortable with it. And I came to learn, as somebody who teaches and studies communication, that not everybody has that same level of comfort. And that's why I got really interested in the latest book. But my interest in communication dates back to when I was a little kid.
I love that. I think for all of us, it's the lessons that we learn and that storage of those moments. If you ever spoke at something and you had a great response, boy, you remember that and you think, boy, I could do that again. But if you had a bad response, you're like, I never want to be put in that situation again. And I remember in school, you used to have to do presentations or you'd have to read your paper at the front of the class and such. And I can remember friends who just really struggled with that and would just dread. We knew we're doing it on Thursday and the whole week just, hating Thursday. I've never had that situation. The joke in my family is if I stand next to a tree long enough, we'll start a conversation. So it's hard for me to understand that because it's always come very natural to me. But over the years, I have people around me that I realize this is a real struggle. But the other thing is thinking smart and thinking fast.
Yes.
So for me, I'm a quick responder. I run that problem solving logic through my head really fast. It's very natural for me. And a lot of it, I think, has come from over the years in my career being able to do that. But I know I've had people work for me who a day or two later will come back and say, here's the answer. And I'm like, ooh, that's great. But unfortunately, we already moved on. We had to fix that problem yesterday. And I started seeing that trend. And so I started figuring out, I need to ask those people a couple days early. Don't need an answer today. Think about it. So that by the time we all got together, the rapid responders had their instant answer, and the others had had time to think about it. So I want to hear about your book because I know the things that I've done like that to try to help people, but I know you've got a process that's going to help everybody.
Well, I hope so. One of the things that I want to make very clear, because both of us, you and I, both shared how we are comfortable and became comfortable with this notion of speaking in the moment. Many people, as you highlighted, don't feel the same way. And yet we can learn to become more comfortable and confident. Many of us just write that off as a skill we don't have. We don't have the gift of gab. It's just not of who we are. And I'm here to tell you, after years and years of helping people develop these skills, it is possible. It takes some effort, but you can get better at it. So in the book and in a methodology that I've been teaching for almost a decade now, it's 6 steps, and these 6 steps can be divided into 2 major categories: mindset and messaging. So when it comes to being better speaking in the moment, we first have to work on mindset, which to my mind consists of 4 distinct parts. First, we have to manage anxiety. Anxiety looms large in most of our communication, planned or spontaneous. The next step is we have to disabuse ourselves of trying to get it right. When we communicate, many of us want to do it right. And I'm here to tell you, after decades of doing this work, there is no right way to communicate. There are better ways and worse ways, but there is no right way. And by striving to be right, we actually make it more likely that we will not do as well as we'd like. Step 3 is seeing these circumstances not as threats and challenges, but actually opportunities, and embracing that opportunistic mindset. And then the 4th step in the mindset category is listening. And this seems a little strange, but actually to be better at spontaneous speaking, you need to become a better listener because you need to focus in on what is needed in the moment. I'll give you a quick example. This happened to me. I came out of a meeting with a colleague, and the colleague said, "What did you think? How do you think that went?" And it was a devastating meeting. We did very poorly. It didn't go well. I just immediately went into itemizing all the things that went wrong and all the things we need to do better next time. But had I really listened, I would have noticed that my colleague came out the back door, not the front door where the rest of us left. He was looking out the window. He was talking very quietly. He really didn't want feedback in that moment. What he wanted was support. He wanted to be consoled and connected with. And what I did was exactly the wrong thing. I just piled on. So we need to listen to understand what is needed in the moment. So those are the first 4 steps. It's about managing anxiety, removing perfection as the goal, seeing it as an opportunity, and listening deeply. Then it comes to messaging, how you actually craft your messages. And I'm a huge fan of structure, frameworks. And then after that, we have to be focused. Many of us ramble when we speak in the moment. We just say things without having a clear purpose and direction. So those 6 steps together can really help people feel more comfortable and confident when communicating.
That is so fabulous because I'm sure for our listeners, they've been sitting here thinking through things. We all grab a conversation in our head and you start to listen to those steps. You're like, oh yeah, I should do that. Oh yeah, that's a bad habit I have. I ramble on and on. I don't bring all the points back together. I mean, even as you talk through it, you re-summarize the points when you got to the end. There's no reason we all can't do that when we talk about something, right? But what do? We go so far right. Yeah. And then people forgot what we were talking about in the beginning. But you also pointed out it's recognizing who you're working with, where you are in the moment. I think we've lost the moment through technology, and Lord knows I'm a fan of technology, but we're not as attentive as we used to be. We're shooting off those emails we got to get that response back, right? As soon as we see it, we've got to send that back out. And the problem is we don't think through it. We don't craft the message. We don't say things so that it's correct. We don't make our points in there. We just click send.
And some of that is a pressure we put on ourselves because in these in the moment circumstances, we feel like we have to respond right away. Part of the success of our response is how quickly we make it. And you're exactly right. Technology is making this more difficult. We get texts and Slacks and everything that come in instantly, and they give us this sense like we have to respond right away. And taking a beat, taking a second to formulate your thoughts. If it's in an interaction that's synchronous, you could actually ask follow-on questions. You can paraphrase. You can do things that give you a little bit of time to make sure that your response is the one that you want, so you're not regretting it or not completing it.
I am a huge believer in the draft folder. I will write a response and then I will just let it sit in the draft folder. I don't hit reply. I just start a different one because I don't want to accidentally send it.
Yeah.
So I just start a new one in there and then I'll cut and paste it over. But I'm like, I need to sit on this, or I need to look at this better. I need to reread the email and make sure I'm really answering what they're asking me.
I love that approach. And we can do the same thing when we are speaking in the moment. I mean, what you've just described is when you have a little time and perhaps not synchronous. But in the moment, you can do the same thing. You can take a pause. You can ask a clarifying question. You can paraphrase. You can collect multiple questions. For example, if it's a Q&A at once, you don't always have to go question, answer, question, answer. You could say, I'd love to hear 3 or 4 questions, and then I'll put together some answers for those. And then you can do some relating of ideas, common themes. So there are lots of ways to do what you're doing with your draft folder when you're in the moment synchronously communicating.
I love that. So talk to us a little bit about thinking faster in general, because some people just naturally do. Some people don't. Some people do situationally. When they're trained, they've spent a long time in a career, they're really great at that. But when you take them out of that space, they're not good at it in other areas.
Absolutely. And I love this question. Thank you. In the book, I interviewed lots of people, and I want to share briefly 2 interviews I did. So I interviewed with Ari Fleischer. I don't know if you remember him. He was press secretary for former President Bush. And I talked to him about, as a press secretary, you have so many things flying at you so fast and furious. How did you manage it? And I also interviewed a woman who is a visual graphic note taker. I don't know if you've ever seen this, but while meetings are going on, somebody's actually visually representing what's said, not taking the words, but the images. And it struck me that she and Ari Fleischer are doing the same thing. They are using pattern recognition to connect ideas together to help catalyze and expedite their responses. So they are looking for patterns and connecting things that they already know to things that they're learning in the moment. And that accelerates their ability to respond. So Ari Fleischer actually said he learns through osmosis. He's just constantly absorbing information. And when he sees something that's new, he can connect it to something that he's already absorbed. And that accelerates how quickly he can respond. In other words, he's able to put 1 and 1 together more quickly because he's constantly looking for these patterns. The artist was telling me how she is always looking for what are the key themes, what's the bottom line, what are the patterns here? And then she represents those patterns visually, and that helps her to do her job in real time. So part of the way we think faster is to look for patterns and connect things that we know to things that we're learning in the moment. If we're simply taking information in, it's harder to process that than if we're connecting it to what we already know. And one of the things in the research on expertise, what makes somebody an expert, is they're able to recognize patterns more quickly. And there's a lot of research. For some reason, they like studying chess masters. Part of what makes a chess master good at what they do is they recognize patterns of what's playing on the board in a way that a novice doesn't. And because they recognize that pattern, they can respond more quickly. And we can all do the same. But we have to approach our communication with a different mindset. We have to see it as looking for patterns rather than just intaking information. And when we do that, it expedites how we think. And then if we apply a structure, that expedites how we speak.
It's interesting, particularly for our listeners. You just gave me an aha moment in my head, because my background is in instructional design. which in the early days, we also blended in with graphic design before those became two separate fields, but we used to have to be responsible for doing both. I never watch a movie, a commercial, anything without picking it apart in my head. So I look like looking at you, I look at the background, I look at, what you have posted. I look at what do those different things mean, because we all have things behind us that always mean something to us. That's why they're there. So when I watch something, I will note and I will comment, and people are just like, what? And I'm like, well, yeah, he's got this on the shelf. I never made that connection that if I rewatch a movie, which oftentimes, we do, we'll rewatch a really good movie.
In my case, really bad movies, but yes.
Yeah. But I'll catch that. And then the next time I catch something different. So obviously it's a little more intuitive for me, but I think part of it is from my training because I've always had to be very visual in instructional design. I think for our listeners, for many of them, when you're in IT, when you're in instructional design, curriculum development, those kinds of areas, you are more visual than perhaps if you're teaching, where visual is a little different because now we're talking about people. And this brings me to thinking of things like doing a TED Talk and getting on that stage, whether it's small or large. But how is it that you take that skill set and you move that over then into a more audience, whether it's your students or someone listening, taking that skill set over and capturing how am I thinking rapidly and how am I delivering and answering, questions from the audience, et cetera, as you're working through that kind of scenario.
Right. Absolutely. So with the assumption that you have done some work on managing anxiety and reframing these circumstances as opportunities, and you're not worried about doing it exactly right. You're just worried about connecting instead of being perfect. Assuming that's the case, what really helps you as you're looking for those patterns, be they visual or verbal, is next taking the information and leveraging a structure to package that information up. And in so doing, it not just helps you because a structure actually gives you a guide of how to say things. In some ways, it's like a recipe. But for your audience, it packages it up in a way that can be very useful. So to me, a structure is nothing more than a logical connection of information. It's not a list. And it also has in it a beginning, a middle, and an end. So I want to use your example of advertisements, since you gave an example of how you look for ads. So when you are watching an ad, they typically follow a common structure or pattern. They start by saying, here's a problem in the world, here's a solution to that problem, and here are the benefits of that particular solution. So the structure they use is problem, solution, benefit. So if I am having to pitch an idea to you, Sher, for example, I might frame the problem that I'm trying to solve. I'll then share how I solve it and then explain how you'll benefit from it. Knowing that structure, that recipe, makes it very easy for me to share my information with you because I have a map. It gets me from point A to point B. And for you, because you're used to this type of pattern, because it's packaged nicely, it's easier for you to process. So part of what helps you think faster and talk smarter is being able to recognize these patterns and then package up your information in a way that's useful. So there are many different structures. In the second half of my book, I cover 6 at least different structures for different circumstances: answering a question, giving feedback, introducing yourself. All of those are spontaneous events that you can leverage structure to help you get through.
Oh, and I love that because for me, I am a visual person. I learn by watching a video. I learn by reading an example. It's not just getting the theory, and the foundational pieces. Those are fine. But when I read someone's example, it all comes together for me. It all clicks for me. For our listeners, I think also just the ability to be able to see those different types of structures and think through what are the different things I did in the last year, or what are the things I have coming up on the calendar, and how could I even just pattern out a structure for those, just to start working through that process. Because I think that is, we put these things off when we have to speak, when we have to present. I always joke that people always say, oh, it's, there's a conference next spring and I'm putting in to present for it. And then you get yes, you've been accepted. And then they go, oh, I have to present in the spring. And I'm like, But you asked to do that. But you're asking because you want to present. You're asking because someone said it needs to be on your CV, or you need to have the experience, or there's some reason you're doing that. So we're not innately going out and searching, for the most part, for ways to go and speak and ways to do these kinds of things. It's usually there's a catalyst that's pushing us into that arena. And I think that's where part of our anxiety comes from, is because someone says to you, we'd love for you to do this. And you say, oh, gee, my boss asked me to do this. Okay, great, I'll do it. And then the reality sets in of what you've agreed to do. And you're like, oh, now this is a problem because it wasn't my idea. I would have never gotten up there and done it had he not asked me to do this. So talk to us a little bit about what are some of the things for anxiety and just getting in that right headspace.
Absolutely. Anxiety looms large in all communications, planned or spontaneous. And there are really two ways to manage anxiety. And I use that term manage very purposefully. I don't believe we can truly overcome our anxiety, nor would we want to. Anxiety is actually helpful, helps you focus, gives you energy, but you want to manage it so it doesn't manage you. So in order to manage anxiety, we have to take a two-pronged approach. We have to manage the symptoms as well as sources. Symptoms are the things that we physiologically experience. When I get nervous, my heart rate beats faster, I blush and I perspire. Some people get shaky, dry mouth, a whole bunch of things happen physiologically. But we also have to look at the sources, the things that initiate and exacerbate our anxiety. So let me give you some real quick examples of things we can do for each category, if that's okay.
Absolutely.
So for the symptoms, the single best thing you can do is to take a deep belly breath. If you've ever done yoga or Tai Chi or Qigong, it's a deep abdomen breath. And what's most important is not the inhale, it's the exhale. It's during the exhale that the magic relaxation response happens. So you need to make your exhale longer than your inhale. And the rule of thumb, or if you don't mind, the rule of lung is you want your exhale to be twice as long as your inhale. So if you take a 3 count in, a 6 count out, and you only have to do that 2 or 3 times to see the impact. Second, if you're somebody like me who blushes or perspires when you get nervous, this is because your core body temperature is going up. Your heart's beating faster and you're pumping more blood through tighter tubes. When we get nervous, we get tight. So your blood pressure goes up and that makes you hotter. It's just like when you exercise. Most of us perspire and turn red when we exercise. So we have to cool ourselves down. The single best way to cool ourselves down is to hold something cold in the palms of your hand. The palms of your hand are thermoregulators for your body, just like your forehead or the back of your neck. If you've ever had a fever, you've probably put a cold compress on your forehead to cool you down. Palms of your hand are the same way. On a cold morning, sure, I bet you have held warm coffee or tea in a cup and felt it warm you up. We're doing just the same thing in reverse. Hold a cold bottle of water before you speak. It'll reduce the blushing, reduce the sweating. So those are things you can do for the symptoms. And there are many, many others. The very first book I wrote was called Speaking Up Without Freaking Out. And it's 50 techniques based on academic research to calm your nerves when speaking. The second set is the sources of anxiety, and there are many. I've already mentioned striving for perfection, seeing it as a threat. We have to change that. Another one that really makes people nervous is the goal we are trying to achieve. Whenever you communicate, you have a goal. My students, they want to get a good grade. The entrepreneurs I coach want to get funding. The people that listen into this might want their project or program funded or supported. What makes us nervous is thinking about it not happening. So what happens if we fail in our goal? In other words, we're worried about a potential negative future outcome. So the way to short circuit that source of anxiety is to become very present oriented. By definition, if I'm in the present moment, I'm not worried about the future. So we can get present oriented by doing something physical. Actors and actresses will shake their body out. You can walk around the building if you want. You can do what athletes do, listen to a song or a playlist, or even play a video game. Do something that gets you in the present moment. My favorite way to get present oriented is to say tongue twisters. You can't say a tongue twister right and not be in the present moment. So these are ways to manage both symptoms and sources that help you manage your anxiety. Not every technique works for every person. That's why the first book I wrote lists 50 techniques. I'm happy if 3 or 4 of those work for any one individual. But by finding those techniques and putting them into practice, you will become more confident and you will appear less nervous.
And I love that. And I think for our listeners, I do certain things always before an event, always before I'm doing, even in the virtual world, always preparing. And I think preparation is key, not just in the messaging that you're doing, but in getting yourself prepared. We've all sat through, and as teachers, you and I both know this, both in K through 12 and in college, we've sat through those classes where like, wow, this is really boring. How long is this person going to speak? And then you have those other teachers that could be the worst subject, but you're like, man, I love going to that class. He or she is just, they make it so interesting. Well, they prepare not just their messaging, but they prepare themselves. They're excited when they get on that stage, when they get in front of that classroom. I think about that all the time. I think about seeing that. Yeah, I don't want to be that person.
No. And you bring up many good points I'd love to comment on.
Yes.
The big counterintuitive notion in the book, Think Faster, Talk Smarter, is that you can prepare to be spontaneous, which sounds like, what does that mean? But I tell everybody, if you've ever played a sport, if you've ever played a musical instrument, how did you get good at it? You practiced. But when you are playing jazz, for example, or you're playing in a basketball or soccer match, you have to be spontaneous in the moment, but you're basing that spontaneity on the practice and preparation. So that's number one. And then the other thing you said that I think is so important is we have to remember that communication is not just information transfer, it's emotion transfer as well. So if I can be excited myself about my topic, or if I can be really passionate about what I'm doing, people will learn the material, the information through the emotion that I bring to it. So we have to remind ourselves why it's important to us and think about how we can get others excited about it. Such a big difference.
And the relationship we have with the speaker or with our teacher in the sense of trust.
Oh, yeah.
When you hear someone who kind of stands there and goes over, the 12 points of whatever, you kind of don't really buy into it. And you really don't know, is that true? Are there really 12 points? Should there be more? When you have someone that really speaks to you, that is really there and present, that is really excited, you build a relationship with that person. This is why when you listen to a podcast or you listen to an audiobook, you feel like you know them. I saw a great quote this week after the passing of Jimmy Buffett that said, Jimmy Buffett was my best friend and we never met.
I love that. Yes. And there's a level of intimacy and connection, immediacy that happens with good communicators, be they teachers, leaders, whatever. And I agree with you.
And so I think for our listeners, it's so important that as you're out working, if you're working in a startup, if you're an entrepreneur, if you're still teaching, if you're an administrator, whatever it is that you're doing, ultimately, it's not just about the messaging that you're giving, but it's about having that relationship with people and them building a trust with you, whether it's a one-off time or whether it's multiple times. When we go to conferences, we see hundreds of people presenting, yet you always hear about the same few presentations that everyone just gushed about. Think about when you go to a presentation and you walk by a room and this poor individual has like 3 people in there. And the guy across, they've run out of seats, they're like packed in the doorway. Why? Because when you walk by, you can hear him or her. And they're excited about what they're talking about. And they're talking right to you. And when you look in the other room, you can barely hear that person, even though they're on a microphone in a ballroom. It's a total difference. And when you start to observe those kinds of things, you start to think about, which side do I want to be on? I want to be that guy. I want to have that kind of audience. And I want to have people come up afterwards and say, wow, this was great. I'd love to connect with you further. I love your information. But also, I just really enjoyed the presentation. That's the point that we're talking about getting to when you're being in that external audience. But the smallest piece of that is that person taking the time, swimming like a salmon upstream through the audience to get to you to say, I really enjoyed that. That's that relationship key right there.
Absolutely. And that's why I say communication is about connection, not perfection. And so we really want to foster those relationships. And that allows us to not just get our point across in the moment, but make it easier for us to communicate in the future as well.
And, I love that because I think we've become so enamored with being perfect. We want everything to go exactly right. And I had the good fortune, a colleague of mine did a TED Talk when TED first came out. And it was wonderful because we were able to watch it live while they were taping it.
Mm-hmm.
And he literally got up there, gave his opening line, and he stopped. And his mind went blank.
Yeah.
And someone from the back of the room yelled out, the first line. And as soon as she did that and he said it, he went on. And the rest of his talk was fabulous. But they cut that out, of course, when they put the finished product out. So when you watch his video, it is perfection. Everything is great. He does all the right things. And when you watch all of the TED Talks, they're all that way. What you don't realize is what the people do behind the scenes to prepare, how many rehearsals they have, the fact that it gets edited. That's really the magic that you have to see, because then you go, oh, maybe I could do that.
I love that you say that. And I spend time in the book talking about that. One of the reasons people fear speaking is they feel that they have to be as good as these role models that they have, the TED speakers, the leaders, the politicians who have been trained extensively, who have worked very hard. Very few of us, when we play a sport, would ever realistically compare ourselves to some expert professional in the sport. I love basketball, but I'm not judging my performance in basketball by comparing myself to Steph Curry. That's unrealistic. Yet we do the same thing. We do that very thing when we are communicating. We say a good speaker is somebody who speaks like that TED speaker or Steve Jobs or Michelle Obama, whoever the people we're thinking of. And that's just not fair to ourselves because we don't have the training. We don't have the background. We haven't put in the reps. So we need to be more realistic. And when we let go of that perfection, all of a sudden we have more cognitive resources to focus on what we're saying. So we actually improve. I have the audacity on the very first day of my strategic communication class I teach at Stanford's Business School to tell my students to maximize mediocrity. Their jaws drop. They're like, what the? Nobody in their lives has ever said, just be mediocre. But the logic is this: when you remove the pressure of doing it right, you actually free up resources to do it better. So the whole saying on the end of that first class, I say, maximize mediocrity to achieve greatness. And they understand it after we go through that whole logic and some activities, that when we let go of being perfect, we can actually do things really, really well.
And I think that's also physical attributes. Before the event, we're thinking about what we wear and what our hair looks like. And, for women, is my makeup perfect? And do I look too fat? Do I look too thin? All of these things that by the time we get there, we've had such a critique. And you walk in and they say, hey, welcome. We're so glad you're doing this. Here's your stage. And they're fine. Yes. But we've gone through this whole mental critique. We're exhausted by the time we get out there.
Yeah, two things to say to that. One, in psychology, they actually talk about something called the spotlight effect. We feel like we are constantly in the spotlight and everybody's looking and judging us. And the reality is people aren't. They aren't scrutinizing us in most situations to the level we think they are. Now, certainly there are situations, a job interview, for example, where people are scrutinizing you. But most of the time they're not. The reality is that most of us are in our own spotlights, worried about it, and we're not paying so much attention to others. So that's number one. And then number two, you highlight this notion of negative self-talk. We say a lot of negative things to ourselves, especially around communication. We say things like, oh, you better not screw up, or I should have practiced more, or that person's so good, I'll never be that good. All that negative self-talk actually makes it more likely that we'll do poorly. So there's some really good research that says if we can replace negative self-talk with positive affirmations or mantras, and it don't have to be like, I'm the best communicator ever. It can simply be, I have value to bring, or the audience can learn from me. In most communication situations, you've been asked to speak. Somebody's asking you a question. They're bringing you in because you know something. And if we remind ourselves that I have value here, that can cancel out that negative self-talk, and you'll actually feel better and do better.
Absolutely. I always think back to, and it's probably 30 years old now, but if you remember when Michael Jordan was on Saturday Night Live and he was with Stuart Smiley, Stuart was telling him to look in the mirror. you're good enough, you're strong enough, and gosh darn it, people like me. But what's funny is that meme and that clip have lived this whole time because that's truly what we feel we need.
Yeah.
We don't feel good about ourselves oftentimes. And so we're looking for that affirmation. And as much as we joke about it, there's a part of us that goes, yeah, I do need someone to say that to me. So I love that you're covering all of this in the book, because I think as a business owner, as an educator, it spans across. Communication is key for everything that we do. Communication is key for everything that we write, that we want to move forward. Our messaging is who we are and what we're broadcasting out to the world. But also, there's so much noise right now. Social media is a lot of noise that we get impacted by daily, and we critique who's great, who's not, what they look like. So talk to us a little bit about how we transfer this into the social media world.
Yeah, absolutely. So a lot of social media is expected to be a rapid turnaround, right? Responses right away. So a lot of these tools and ideas around being efficient and responsive are critical. The biggest thing I think that comes from what I talk about that applies to social media are two. One, you really need to know your audience. In all communication, the biggest mistake people make is they focus on what they want to say rather than what the audience needs to hear. So you need to be audience centric. So in doing social media, you really have to think about what is it that's of value to the audience. That's number one. And number two, you have to be concise. Concision is key. My mother has this saying, I know she didn't create it, but I love it. It's tell me the time, don't build me the clock. Many people are clock builders. They tell you more than they need to. Now, some social media platforms have restrictions in terms of how much you can say. And there are some benefits to that because that requires you to really focus your messages. But similarly, we have to do that on platforms that don't have restrictions. What's the least amount of words I can use to get my idea across? Very rarely do people complain that you said too little. Right? People often will complain you said too much. So when it comes to social media, we really have to know our audience, and we really have to reflect on how we can be more concise and clear in what we're saying.
And in academia, that is very difficult because we are grown to say a lot, provide a lot, publish a lot. And it is. And you get in the business world, you're like, wow, they don't talk like this, and they don't use that many slides in a deck to get their message across.
Think about me. I mean, I'm an academic who teaches communication. I talk way too much. My wife constantly reminds me to follow my own advice.
I love that. So Matt, tell us, what are other things that you're working on and doing right now in addition to this? I know you said that you're teaching at Stanford. What other things are you
thank you.
carrying your message through to?
Yeah, so I'm spending a lot of time developing resources to support the book. I have many already. I believe you learn communication best by doing communication. And so I'm providing lots of resources in terms of videos and workbooks and guides. All of this can be found at mattabrahams.com. I host my own podcast, Think Fast, Talk Smart. We've just had our 100th episode. And so we're looking at redefining how we look for the next 100. So that's very exciting as well. And I am getting ready to start teaching. My academic quarter starts in just a few weeks. So a lot of my time is being spent revamping curriculum and preparing for my students.
Well, all of it is very exciting. And all of it really shows not just what you're working on, but really the passion that you have for this topic. And one of the things that I always tell people is look for the passion, because those are the people that will move you forward. And for our listeners, both of your books, I think, are really, really important to what you're doing and where you're going forward. So I encourage everyone, where can they access your books at?
You can buy the books wherever you buy books, online, audio. You can find them on Amazon from Simon & Schuster, who published the book. You can go to my website, mattabrahams.com, and you'll find both books and links to getting them there. The podcast is anywhere you find podcasts. Think Fast, Talk Smart is the name.
Excellent. Matt, it's been wonderful having you on today. This has been a great conversation, and you and I could probably talk for another hour about this. But I was so excited to bring this to our listeners because I really think this has been the missing piece for many people that are working in the ed tech industry. They're good at what they do, but they're not always good at communicating it. And they're not always good in understanding how to read the room, how to prepare. And really, for our young startups, they've not had enough life experience to recognize what's wanted from the audience out there. So I encourage you all to grab books. I'm excited to hear you're getting videos and worksheets out there as well, because I think that will be just a really nice package for people to tap into. So I want to thank you for joining us today. And I want to thank everyone who's listening. As always, we hope this information is beneficial for you, and you can find us, and all of Matt's information will be loaded with our podcast when it goes live, when it gets posted. We want to thank you for attending EdTech Speaks again. And until then, keep learning.
Thank you for listening to EdTech Speaks with EdTech strategist Cher Downing. To learn more about the services Downing EdTech and its staff can provide you, find us at www.downingedtech.com. If you enjoyed today's podcast, be sure to share it. We'd also like to hear from you regarding any suggestions for topics or guests and the value you received from our show. Check back for new podcasts with featured guests at www.downingedtech.com/podcast.